Okay, so we're going to start. Thanks everyone for coming out. My name is Jason Bosch, and I run Argus Fest, which is a local organization that works to raise awareness of human rights, social justice, media, and environmental issues. For the past 8 years, we've been showing documentaries, bringing in guest speakers. We brought in art exhibits and done music concerts as well. So every Thursday we show documentaries at the Mercury Cafe, 22nd in California at 7 p.m. And then on Mondays we're at a little coffee shop on East Colfax called Hook on Colfax. It's right by the Bluebird Theater. This Monday we're showing a movie called Yes Men Fix the World. If you're not familiar with the Yes Men, they're some merry pranksters, political pranksters that have come up with some pretty clever ways to draw attention to various issues. So it's a really great film that just came out. So tonight's event is something that's kind of a personal thing for me. In my life, I've always questioned religion, even as a very small kid. And by the time I was 12, I was pretty much done with religion. I thought, you know, I don't understand why people still believe this. That was just my worldview. And so I started to read a lot of Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins. And I agreed with them intellectually, but there was something that didn't quite set with me. Well, mostly, not entirely. But there's something that didn't quite set well with me because I also study human rights. And so particularly like I read Sam Harris's book, and it seemed like he was looking at the entire world extremely, just only through a religious lens. In other words, studying like, say, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, he didn't seem to have an understanding of a lot of the other things that are going on besides just the religion. And so I started to kind of question the atheist movement, although I still have sympathies with it. And then I read a book by Chris Hedges called I Don't Believe in Atheists, which is a really great book, in my view. You know, David, you might disagree with me. So anyways, I wanted to have an event. My friend Robert Jensen, I've done several events with him over the years, and he was coming to town, and his new book is called All My Bones Shake. And so I wanted to kind of have an event to kind of flesh out some of these ideas. So I also invited David Eller, who's a local academic. He teaches at CCD. He's written Natural Atheism, and he's written also a book about violence. And so I thought this would be a really good opportunity to kind of flesh out some of these ideas. They're each going to say about 15-minute introduction from where they're coming from, and then we'll open it up to questions. So, and also, there's a donation bucket. If you'd like to donate, we ask for a suggested $5 to Argus Fest to help keep these types of events going. And there's there's 3 DVDs, so there's a bunch of documentaries over here on all sorts of various human rights subjects that you're welcome to take home with you, and a mailing list for Argus Fest. So check that out. And with that said, Robert Jensen, you want to start?
Thank you, Jason. I think Jason might qualify for the hardest working, unpaid progressive activist I know in Denver and possibly in the country. So thank you, Jason. I'm always amazed at how much Jason gets done. The first time I came here, I thought Argus Fest was some major sort of organization with dozens of staff people, and then I found out it was Jason. So he's really put a lot of his heart and soul into this work over the years. So thanks, Jason. This is a bit strange for me because the combination of the distance, the darkness, and the fact that I had eye surgery this year and still have not fully recovered means I don't have a clue how you people are going to react to this. Usually you try and read the group. I can't see any of you, so.
We're naked.
Well, thank God I can't see. I mean, now I'm grateful for that.
Burn.
So if I'm getting off track with you, I'm not going to be able to notice. To try and keep to 15 minutes, I'm not going to narrate the story that brings me to this particular book and this place. If I were to do it in 2 or 3 sentences, my story is much like Jason's in the sense that I think by the time I was about 8 or 9, I couldn't figure out why people went to church. It all seemed pretty strange to me growing up in a middle-of-the-road Presbyterian church in Fargo, North Dakota. The joke I always tell is, for me, my early experiences with religion were life-threatening because I was almost bored to death by the whole enterprise. So the minute my parents stopped making me go to church, I fled from the whole enterprise and was a self-identified atheist, secular person my adult life. Also got involved in left feminist politics, and my whole life was framed by the analyses of the illegitimate structures of power that dominate this country and this world within feminist politics, anti-racist politics, anti-capitalist politics, anti-empire politics. And as I was working through all of those things, I found all of those frameworks very helpful in understanding how the world that we live in works. And as I was doing more and more writing and public speaking, I adopted what I thought was a pretty pithy little line. For instance, when talking about gender and masculinity and the very toxic construction of masculinity in societies that are patriarchal, which is almost all societies, I would say you can be a man and all that implies in patriarchy, or you can be a human being, but you can't be both. And that line seemed to work, so I would repeat it in other arenas, and I would make the claim that you could be white in a white supremacist society like the United States, or you could be a human being, but you can't be both. I would argue that you can be an American and embrace all that means in ideological terms, or you can be a human being. So you get the point. I was suggesting that the systems within which we live erode and corrode our own humanity. And as I was working through all of that, I started to think, well, there's kind of an unasked and unanswered question in all of that, which is, what does it mean to be a human being? Especially, what does it mean to be a human being in this moment in time, which I think is a very important moment in time. Perhaps people always think they live at the most crucial time in history. That might be a conceit of people in general. But I do think there are a lot of issues we face, cascading crises, you might call them, that do make this a very important time. So as I was working through the traditional left critical feminist political analyses, I started also to think more deeply about how to answer that question. And about that same time, pretty much by accident, I bumped into coincidentally a Presbyterian minister in Austin, Texas named Jim Rigby, who I had heard of and knew as a political activist as well as a minister. He had a small church in suburban Austin, and as I got to know him, I realized that in addition to pursuing the same political agenda that basically I had, he was part of a progressive Christianity, it's often called, although I think that term really doesn't apply to him and his church, because I think it's far more radical than the term progressive might apply or might connote. And what I realized is that there were Christians, not only in the contemporary period, but as I started to learn historically, who did not conceive of Christianity as a set of supernatural beliefs or creeds. That, in fact, there was another approach to the concept of Christianity. And so I realized there were people who, like me, did not believe in God, if by God we mean a force, an entity, or a being somewhere up in the sky that is directing the universe. Like Jason, I mean, I gave up that belief when I was fairly young and still hold to that rejection of that. And I also learned there were Christians who did not take the resurrection of Christ as a literal historical fact. As I like to say, as far as I can tell, Jesus died and he stayed dead. And that all of this could be understood in poetic, metaphorical, symbolic terms, and that was not just a contemporary phenomenon, but in fact it had historical roots. And so I started hanging out at the church. I eventually joined that church. The more conservative elements within the denomination promptly tried to kick me out of the church when I wrote about Christianity without supernatural claims. And the more traditional conservative elements didn't much like that. But don't worry, I'm back as a member in good standing of the church. Some of you may have been worried there momentarily about the state of my soul, but rest assured, I'm on the path to righteousness again and a full member. You can always tell when you're a full member of a church because they accept your money and in fact solicit it, so that's a good mark of membership. And I've continued to sort of think through these questions, not only in a secular political context, although that still is a primary source of insight for me, but also through theology, through the stories, through the text and the tradition. In my case of Christianity, having been born in the United States, a country that is overwhelmingly Christian in character. If you look at public opinion polls, about 75% of the population of the United States identifies as Christian, whatever that might mean when they answer that question. About the same time, I also was working with a number of Muslims in political endeavors, and realized there was a progressive Islam that was being crafted as well. And I got much more interested in these things. And it seemed to me that when we are facing the crises that we are, I'm willing to draw on the wisdom and the organizing potential of any tradition that it seems to me is aimed at the fundamental values that I hold, which are values around justice and sustainability, and a way of organizing our concerns about the world, recognizing the profound injustice that shapes human systems and the fundamentally unsustainable nature of contemporary culture. And in doing that, I started to think through ways to articulate that in this culture. And I started talking about what in the book I write about as the four fundamentalisms. The first fundamentalism we're most familiar with, which is religious fundamentalism, and the dangers of religious fundamentalism are well known. I won't rehearse them here. I also started to think about fundamentalism in the context of our conception of the nation. There's a national fundamentalism in the United States that, much like religious fundamentalism, that takes or claims a certainty in understanding the way the world works and the way the world should operate. Just like there is a religious fundamentalism, there's a national fundamentalism, a kind of hyper-patriotism that shapes this culture and is also extremely dangerous. We also live in a culture with a kind of market fundamentalism, especially since the fall of the Berlin Wall, a historical event I was very grateful to see, but it did eliminate from the world stage the presence of the concept of socialism. Whether the Soviet Union and its satellites were ever socialist is a debate we could have, but it certainly sort of freed up capitalists to make the claim that their economic system was now not only the best of competing systems, but in a sense the state of nature. And there evolved a kind of market fundamentalism, and we've seen the consequences of that particularly recently. So in addition to those three fundamentalisms, which are, I think, easy to identify, I also started to think about, in some ways, what might be the most dangerous and in the end debilitating fundamentalism of them all, which is what some people have referred to as technological fundamentalism. That in addition to all of the injustice produced by human systems, there's this profound, or this fundamental unsustainability of a high-energy, high-technology culture. And the technological fundamentalism, I think, is seen when we face the problems created by this high-energy, high-technology culture. The answers that so many people want to offer, the solutions, so to speak, to those problems, are simply more high-energy, high-technology processes in gizmos to solve the problems created by high-energy, high-technology. And I think there's a kind of fundamentalism in that as well that I actually think may turn out.
Something you said?
No, nobody ever pays attention to what I say enough for things to act in reaction. Especially my son, I've learned, in terms of those who don't pay attention. So when I try to organize my thinking around the world we live in, the injustice, the unsustainability of that world, I think those are useful ways to think about it. Well, what does religion have to offer? Well, in the few minutes I have left, as I try to work through these things, I see several tensions that are very difficult to figure out how to resolve. And I think my own sort of investigations into theology, my own now membership in a community that's formed around that theology, have demonstrated to me that there are some positive aspects to that. The two tensions I want to talk about very briefly are the tension between the local and the global. What I mean by this is that if you think about the evolutionary history of the human being, you know, the vast majority of our evolutionary history was in relatively small band level societies, what we tend to use the word tribal. there's a lot of discussion in the United States, and especially in the media, about how there are certain parts of the world that are tribal, like the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, that a lot of tribal people there, and we wonder how they operate, and we are often very perplexed by them. But while that's true, there's a social organization that is tribal there. I think it's important to recognize that we are all tribal. I mean, our evolutionary history is in that level of organization, and we carry that in us. That is, we are always rooted in the local. Our sense of the world is often very, very local like that. At the same time, the reality of the modern world is that we live on one planet. We understand ourselves as one human family, and especially for those of us who live in the imperial societies, there's an importance to always recognizing that, because the wealth of imperial societies, of course, were to a large degree extracted from other parts of the world. So our moral obligation to that world is crucial. We are fundamentally tribal, local animals who understand ourselves in a very specific way, in a very specific place, yet we have obligations to and understandings of ourselves on this global level as well. So this tension between the tribal and the universal, I think, is very hard to navigate sometimes. And I think that's one thing religion can help do, is understand how we live very much in communities as part of a universal human family. The other tension I see is the tension between what I'm going to call humility and righteousness. That is, as I suggested in the discussion of technological fundamentalism, one of the great problems in the animals we are is our tendency to arrogance. And I don't just mean individually. We all probably struggle with our egos and our capacity for arrogance. But I'm talking sort of at a more species level, that if you look at some of the fundamental problems we face in this question of ecological sustainability, a lot of them come from our lack of humility, our belief that human intelligence is adequate to run the world. And what we're discovering, of course, is that human intelligence is not. And I think we need to recover that sense of humility. And I think, again, there are aspects of faith traditions that are very helpful in that. In fact, I would argue that the appropriate way to read the story of Adam and Eve in the garden is a story, a cautionary tale about humility and what happens when human beings believe that they are godlike in that sense. But humility is all well and good, but if we face the kind of injustice we do in this world because of these illegitimate systems of power, then we need to combat them. And to combat them takes a sense of righteousness. You have to have a deep sense, a deep passion for justice, and a faith in your own ability to make the world a more just place if you're going to contribute to that. And so how do we balance this profound need for humility and this profound need for a sense of righteousness, not self-righteousness obviously, but a collective commitment? And one of the things, and this is where I'll end, that I find helpful is the conception in religious traditions of the prophetic. In both the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, the Muslim tradition, this notion of the prophet. And by this I don't mean that I believe there are specific people who have special status, who are prophets. Certainly in the tradition, the term prophet doesn't mean somebody who can see the future. The prophets, if you take the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible prophets, these were people who were condemning the injustice in the societies of their day. They were calling out the corrupt leadership and the complacency of the society. These are people like Jeremiah and Isaiah, Amos, Micah. And what I find really useful about the concept of the prophet, if we can detach from the notion of prophet as a special person, and in fact, the prophets often denied that they had any special status. One of my favorite articulations of this is from Amos. Amos was preaching against the injustice of the king and of the powerful. Eventually the king tried to banish Amos and sent his minions, in this case I think it was Amaziah. So the king sends his high priest Amaziah to tell Amos to go elsewhere and leave the kingdom and prophesize elsewhere. And Amos's response is very interesting. He says, "I am neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but a simple shepherd and a dresser of sycamore trees." So Amos is suggesting that There's nothing special about speaking against injustice, about being rooted in principles about equality, decency, love, dignity, and condemning the abuses. And he's saying you don't have to be special to do it. And I think that prophetic, that notion not of prophets, but of a prophetic voice, a voice that we all have within us, is very crucial, because in a culture like the United States, especially such an affluent culture like the United States, and we should recognize this is the wealthiest society in the history of the world, it's often easy to be lulled into a sense of complacency and to find it easy to avoid ways to speak that truth that often we all know in our hearts. And so one of the things that I take away from the traditions, all of these faith traditions, is the call to the prophetic, the call to remain rooted in a certain humility about the ability of any one person or people in general to know all there is to know about the world. Yet the call to the prophetic, to remain true to what we can know and what we can know about love, decency, justice. And that's where I find myself coming back to. And I come back to it because I find it useful. And in the end, I think my defense of my return to the church, to the degree it needs to be defended, is in that experience. It's as much a question of how I feel when I'm in that community, how I relate to people, what kind of human connections are formed, what kind of networks that allows me to form with others in other communities, and how we can go about the business of trying to change what I think is a trajectory for human society, especially the trajectory of first world, affluent, high technology, high energy societies, that is leading us, pick your metaphor, whether we're going over the cliff, whether we're going off the rails, you know, there are a lot of different ways to try and put that. But I think we have to recognize that we are in that dire of a situation, and then ask ourselves, how are we going to in a productive way, try and change that trajectory. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming out tonight and staying out and sitting in the cold and dark and such for us. As Jason and others, and probably many of you already realized, there's been a lot of noise in our culture recently about religious violence. And that's partly because, of course, there's been a lot of religious violence in the world and in our culture. But I am not one of those Hitchens, Dawkins, Harris kind of atheists who says that religion is the cause of all the bad things in the world, and that religion can only cause bad things in the world. In fact, I think they've really done a disservice to the secular community by adding that to the claim, when, of course, atheism means nothing more than not having any gods in your life, and whatever else, you know, is tangential to that. And in fact, as an anthropologist, I'm happy to tell you that not all religions even have gods. That's not a central or essential religious concept at all. It's a distinct one to certain kinds of religions, the ones that we know really well in our society, but that's not a universal thing in any way whatsoever. What I want to talk about today, because naturally I share almost all of Professor Jensen's values and goals, I just don't see any particular reason to turn to religion to either justify or achieve those goals. In fact, I think in a number of ways, secularism can do it fine and probably better, and I intend to try to show you that today. In fact, I gave Jason some little one-page outlines of my talk. If you haven't received one of those from him, then ask him to get you one. It would be false, of course, to say that religion is unique in the world in creating violence or injustice, but religion, unfortunately, does have certain qualities that make it particularly effective at creating those kind of things. Other phenomena have those properties too. People can obviously be violent or unjust about class things, nationalist things, race things, gender things, for crying out loud, environmental things. People can be violent about anything, quite honestly. Religion, again, is not special in that regard. It just happens to meet some of the criteria for violence and injustice particularly exquisitely. And I want to make one kind of reorienting comment before I head into the bulk of the body of my comments. When I, as an anthropologist, of course, talk about religion, I'm not thinking about Christianity in particular. I'm not even thinking about the Abrahamic traditions in particular. Those are interesting, familiar, and of course, particularly large traditions. But there are, thousands and thousands and thousands of religions out there, and therefore I'm not going to aim my remarks particularly at Christianity, because I'm neither, as religion goes, for it nor against it. It's just one more, quite honestly, from my position. And honestly, I think not maybe one of the ones that has the most potential to help in the violence and justice issues. If you have the outline, the first thing that I mentioned, of course, is that there are a series of criteria or conditions that any kind of human activity can meet that tend to promote both its tendency toward violence and the extremity of that violence. Humans are, let's put it this way, humans have the capacity to violence. If we didn't, it wouldn't be a problem. Some humans more than others, obviously, but it's a human thing. So we do, in fact, have that ability in us. It's a well-established psychological and sociological fact that humans in groups tend to be even more violent. And whether that simply brings out the worst in people or those groups have some of their own kinds of characteristics and dynamics, we're not too sure, and it's ultimately, I guess, not really relevant. But there is even a phenomenon known as the group effect, where groups tend to be more emotional, irrational, credulous, other kinds of bad, impulsive, things like that. And then specific qualities like, of course, the boundary nature of groups, the fundamental us and them phenomenon in groups, so that we inside the group are good and you outside are bad, more or less. The very existence of groups is a potential problem in terms of violence and justice issues, but of course humans are fundamentally group beings, so we always have, unfortunately, that particular mechanism at work in human life. When humans take another step and actually use those kind of group things as part of their own identity, when that becomes part of who they think of themselves, I am one of those and you're not, that's another particularly dangerous kind of escalation in the potential for violence and injustice. When there are sustained and important kinds of interactions between people based on those group identities, so that people either spend a lot of their time with those or only with those, and they begin to think of themselves as having something at stake with those people, obviously that's another potential source of violence. When those kinds of group interactions institutionalize, that is, when they begin to turn into long-term structured kinds of things, that's yet another vehicle for increasing the likeliness and the extremeness of violence. And of course, specific kinds of institutions. Probably the most critical one, if you read people like Philip Zimbardo and Roy Baumeister, who say that the single most dangerous phenomenon is blind obedience to a leader. And of course, leadership is an institutional thing that can't happen to individuals. It's got to be a group kind of thing. Whether it is institutions like patriarchy, or something even more specific like patrilocal residence or patrilineal descent, or just kind of the group occupation, co-optation of institutions like the family, which of course religion didn't invent. Humans have families without religion, other species have families without religion. But when those kinds of phenomena move in and kind of take those over, that's of course another source of danger. When you add, and this is a point I think that Professor Jensen made and made significantly, a lot of religious violence is not about the religion necessarily. When you add to religion other kinds of interests, whether it is land or wealth or power or jobs, education, anything like that, that's another thing to fight about. And in fact, as I wrote in my first book, which I didn't bring today because it's not about religion specifically, in ethnic conflict, ethnic groups are often fighting with religion as kind of like a weapon or tool or banner or flag. They're not fighting about religion. Religion is part of their kind of identity difference, but they're fighting about other practical or impractical things, about who's going to go to heaven or symbolic power, things like that. Religion has a really unique capacity to kind of bond itself to those other kinds of issues, as we'll talk about later on, and that of course makes it even more, again, a little more dangerous and scary. And finally, when groups with leadership and identity and interaction and interests have specific kinds of ideologies, those of course tend to kind of be the final step in the kind of dramatic kind of increase of violence. And of course, specific ideologies more than others. Some ideologies like inclusiveness or kind of oneness with nature, some Buddhist kinds of things, Jain things even more so, where basically all beings share certain things like senses and awareness and things like that. Those, of course, tend to promote nonviolence. But ideologies like exclusivism, again, we're the ones and you're not. Absolutism, you know, it's only our way or no way at all, no possible compromise. Idealism, that it must be perfect. Anything that's not perfect is corrupt and must be thrown out and opposed. Obviously, ideas about some kind of, you know, cosmic good and evil that are struggling against each other, and some kind of notion of a cosmic war, which humans have to take sides on. There is no neutral ground. You know, there are no nonpartisans in such struggles as that. In fact, I remember, I think it was Arthur Koestler who once said, talking about communism, that he was taught two things. One, the front line is no place to ask questions, and two, you're always on the front line. In that kind of mentality, there is no possibility for anything more than struggle to the end. And of course, in some kind of a black and white, good and evil kind of world, there's no, like, you know, making peace treaties with the devil. There's no compromising with the enemy. It's got to be, you know, totally we win or they win. And of course, we win. There's no usually possible conception that we might not win. And quite honestly, sometimes the ends justify the means. Religion then obviously meets all of those criteria, some religions more than others. And if you look at, for example, people like Charles Kimball in his book, When Religion Becomes Evil, he tries to argue that authentic religion, non-corrupted religion, is always good and helpful and, you know, kind, and that only corrupt religion, inauthentic religion, can be bad or violent. And of course, his descriptions of inauthentic religion include things like leadership, obedience to leadership, idea of a holy war, ideas that, you know, that Christianity and most familiar religions have, actually. So that's not actually a helpful analysis at all. Religion does have, though, some specific qualities that set it apart from other kinds of ideas and movements in terms, once again, of its likeliness for promoting violence or other kinds of injustices. As I mentioned, for one thing in my list, religion can promote certain kinds of specific violence that would never occur otherwise. For example, nobody in their right mind would ever sacrifice a cow or a human for any purpose other than a religious one, on the assumption that it would somehow make the world a better place or help me in some way. There is no, I think, except in maybe a metaphorical way, like you're going to sacrifice lunches so you can buy a car or something, or sacrifice your life for your country. Nobody thinks there's some kind of, you know, magical, spiritual, you know, benefit from that. The only possible justification for sacrificial violence is religious. Certain kinds of, but by no means all, self-injuries. Certainly people will starve themselves and burn themselves and cut themselves for all kinds of reasons, from, again, you know, political causes to pathology. But religion has an incredibly wide array of those, as we saw in our class on violence just this past week, and says that these are a good thing, that you're going to be you know, a better person, more beautiful, more likable, more spiritual because of this. And I think, again, that there's hardly any argument in favor of this kind of thing, short of a religious argument for it. Obviously, certain kinds of religious persecutions. Were there no religions and no religious differences, there'd be no religious persecution. What would you be excited about enough to persecute people about? Obviously, people can be persecuted for their race and their politics and their gender identity and other things too, but there are many religion-specific persecutions. Nobody would ever persecute, for example, witches, unless there was a religious notion of witches. There is no non-religious notion of witches. Certain kinds of religious crimes and abuses, when, you know, parents kill their children because they think their children are possessed, or because they think God told them to, or when people you know, kill abortion doctors, or other kinds of, you know, crimes because they think that their religion wants them to. There are, of course, non-religious crimes as well, and plenty of reasons people kill each other for non-religious reasons, but there are some specifically religious ones that would not arise under any other circumstances. There are obviously distinctly religious motivations for violence and injustice, not the least of which is, you know, God told me to, or it will, you know, purify me, or it'll, you know, expiate my sins, or it'll, you know, increase fertility or something else. Those are obviously reasons that people give, or reasons to either defend the religion or to propagate the religion. And obviously if the religion didn't exist, it wouldn't need to be defended or propagated. So a number of those kinds of violent and unjust kind of acts are specifically, again, motivated by religious beliefs or the defense of the religious institution. Third, religion has an unfortunate ability, not a unique ability, but an unfortunate one, to legitimize various kinds of violence. That is to say that this is the kind of violence we ought to be doing. In fact, this is, again, kind of a damnable thing. When religious people commit violence, they usually don't feel unjust about it. They feel perfectly justified about it. That they must do this, or they've been told to do it, they've been ordered to do it. It becomes a command or some kind of sacred duty. We were talking in our violence class just yesterday about the Bhagavad Gita concept that Hindu soldiers should fight. That's their religious duty. That's their karmic duty. And it's not even a big deal to kill the other side because they're doing their karmic duty too. It's all good, quite honestly, to kill and die. In fact, you're actually not even doing them any harm because bodies don't really matter anyhow. A rather distinctly kind of religious idea, because for those of us who are materialists and kind of use our bodies, they matter quite a bit, quite honestly. When religious people commit violence, injustice, crime for religious purposes, they almost always feel perfectly justified about it. That it is a good, appropriate, authorized, because the author of it is in fact some superhuman, spiritual, supernatural, divine, whatever kind of being or source, and don't feel bad about it at all. In fact, think about people like the Lafferty brothers, who were chronicled in John Krakauer's Under the Banner of Heaven, the two kind of extreme Mormons who killed their sister-in-law and her child because they thought she was corrupting their brother in their religion, and they are in prison today for it, and utterly unrepentant. They think that God told them to do it. In fact, they drove around to her house several times waiting for God to tell them not to do it, and he didn't. So they went ahead and did it. And she was home. If God didn't want it, she would have been home or something. And so they say, how could we possibly feel bad about doing something that God told us to do and has not since told us not to do? In fact, it would be disrespectful to God to feel bad about it. And that's only a possible emotional reaction under the banner of religion. Finally, as I mentioned, not finally, next to finally, religion's interesting, but again, not unique capacity to attach itself to other kinds of things. Some of them wonderful, some of them deadly, like nationalism and racism, genderism, and pretty much any other ism, and sometimes in combinations. So you can get particularly virulent things like the KKK, or the Reconstructionist movement that wants to instate, never instated in the first place, Old Testament law in the U.S., so that there would be, the death penalty for adultery and homosexuality and teaching evolution and divorce and all kinds of things like that, which, again, no secular person, even if they're opposed to divorce and evolution, would want the death penalty for it, I don't think. And the Christian identity movement, Anglo-Israelism, things like that. Lots of ways that religion can get mixed up in other stuff and have the multiple doses of virulent kind of beliefs and behavior. And finally, unfortunately, the resistance of religion to reasoning. That is, people like the Laffertys obviously are not going to be talked out of their beliefs. And people don't tend to be, talked into or out of religion in the first place. And therefore, religious people are not usually going to be talked out of their religious violence either, because it's not based on that kind of argument. And therefore, those of us who might want to say, well, you shouldn't do that for these reasons, those reasons don't matter to them. They've got other reasons that matter to them. And that makes religion particularly difficult to tone down, to calm, to mitigate when people are doing things for reasons that I think are not only good, but ultimate, quite honestly. I would not ever say, and I don't want to be cast among those, mean, angry atheists like Harris and Dawkins and Hitchens and Dennett to a certain extent, who make it sound like religion is only bad and, everything bad in the world is based on religion. Religion has some qualities, obviously, that are conducive to nonviolence and justice. Some religions more than others, obviously. But my claim is going to be that existing as they do, they're going to be fairly limited in their scope and in their power. Some of the reasons are going to be obvious from what I've already said. At least one is because, and Professor Jensen's experience as a kind of a liberal, something Christian, showed that Christianity, like every religion, is a spectrum. And of course, there are moderates in the middle, and pacifists on one end, and extreme, violent, fundamentalists on the other. And there will always be that particular branch of the spectrum, of the curve. Even if we promote the mean, even if we celebrate and join with the mean, there's always the extreme. And in fact, promoting the mean and celebrating the mean doesn't eliminate the extreme. And I'm not entirely sure how you do, because we clearly don't want to join them and celebrate them. But they're not listening to us, quite honestly. They couldn't care less if some atheist joined some liberal Christian church, or Buddhism, or Hare Krishna, or whatever else. It's utterly unimpressive to them. And I'm sure you probably met with that experience where they say that you're not a real Christian, and the Presbyterians aren't real Christians either. So, unless you are, a member of, the fundamentalist group, then you're not even a real one. And so, they discount everything but their extreme arm of the curve. As I mentioned, of course, religion, whatever potential religion has for peace and justice, it still doesn't tend to be particularly responsive to reasoning. It tends to be responsive to its own kind of religious claims, which is, wonderful. And so you roughly have to talk to them in those kinds of religious terms. And I can see the value, to an extent, to speaking Christian to Christians, obviously, because they understand that kind of thing. Obviously, outside of the Abrahamic traditions and a few others, words like prophetic have no meaning whatsoever. Most religions in the world don't have prophets. And that would be, they don't have a term for that. There'd be no translation for that into their language. And that would be an uncompelling argument to them. In fact, as I mentioned in the next to last item, religious arguments are only going to be, of course, compelling to members of those religions. That is, you could not, for example, argue even, liberal Christians, let alone fundamentalist ones, out of some position or practice on, say, Hindu principles or, Sikh principles. They don't know them, they couldn't care less by and large. And obviously the same thing too, you're not going to argue fundamentalist, jihadist Muslims out of their behavior, either with reason or with Christianity. They couldn't care less. In fact, Christianity is largely the enemy to them. Therefore, each religion only kind of responds to its own religious arguments, and therefore religion's capacity, insofar as it exists at all, only exists kind of for its own kind. Outside of that community, it's either uninteresting or literally kind of gibberish. No Christian would be motivated by the argument about karma, for example, or getting a better rebirth. It's like, that's not Christian talk, so you can't make that religious argument. You can only make religious arguments to that religion. And of course, to non-religious people, religious arguments are just moot. Don't try to justify or promote nonviolence to me on karma or sin or prophecy or whatever. All those concepts are gibberish to me. Only concepts like reason or culture or human right are going to make any sense to me as a secularist. Which is why I claim finally at the very last item that while some religions do have some capacities to justice and peace, there is nothing in religion in that regard that isn't also in non-religion. Religion brings nothing original to the table. In fact, as I say in the parentheses, everything that's worthwhile and valuable and good about religion is not distinctly religious. And everything about religion that's distinctly religious is not worthwhile and valuable and good. We don't need that. In fact, we can and we have to find our way to peace and justice and dignity and rights using some combination of human nature, our evolved capacities. We know that both morality and religion are evolved psychological, social phenomena, reason, and culture. Those three get everything done that we need to do. In fact, when we, in conclusion, try to judge a religion or some particular religious belief or practice in terms of its contribution to peace and justice, we are using a non-religious standard to do that. We're still judging and understanding religion through some secular, rational, natural, or cultural standard. And we can do that without the religion. We don't need the middleman in that case. We can go straight to the reason and the nature and the culture and make those cases, make those appeals, and try to bring out the best in humans, which religion has borrowed and sometimes corrupted, but never created. Thank you.
By the 4th century, it had become, or was on its way to becoming, the religion of the empire and in the service of power. And the question is there something in it that can be reclaimed? not to serve power, but to resist power. And once one starts to see it as a resistance of power, then it has, I think, a kind of natural, universal quality, because that resistance of power happens whenever power is imposed unjustly, as it so often is.
So, takes a second. So here's a couple for David. This one says, admittedly, secularism has its own brand of values and beliefs, and in fact, ideology. How does one account for the radicalism that is generated with this groupthink? I think it's referring to, if I understand, there's a radicalism amongst secularism. Is that what the person that wrote this was saying? Anyone? Did you get that? Okay, and the second one, discuss the likelihood of atheists eventually becoming a big enough group to take on the characteristics of the religious group that have used religion as one of the many tools to promote evil and violence, etc. So let's start those two.
On the question of what, secular radicalism or something, let's first acknowledge again that any position is going to have, once again, a bell curve of kind of, you know, nice people in the middle and, you know, wimpy ones on one end and, you know, crazy extreme ones on the other. So it wouldn't be unique in any way whatsoever if there were some radical secularists. I'm not entirely sure what that term means, honestly. One reason why I think some people have said some extreme things, like Harris and Dawkins, and I say this with all the respect that I can muster, is because it sells books. You know, saying mild things, you know, inclusive things doesn't excite anybody. So it is unfortunately kind of twisting up, you know, the members and, you know, and messing with the other side too. So part of it is intentionally saying extreme things because they're, you know, highly motivational. I don't personally endorse that. I find it to be counterproductive. In fact, I think a lot of their claims specifically about violence are just dead wrong. They happen to be utterly uninformed about the cross-cultural nature and details of violence. And so Harris's, in fact, I actually wrote a rather scathing review myself of Harris's book, saying the first third of it is kind of interesting. The middle third, where he bashes Islam, is either old or irrelevant, and the third part, you shouldn't just read it all. Because there's some kind of crazy thing about, you know, Buddhist spiritualism or something. And if you're an atheist, don't go there either, quite honestly. I think sometimes secular radicalism is a term that's being applied by the non-secular people, obviously, who would say that anything that opposes their beliefs is radical. And I guess it is kind of. In fact, you know, there are people like me. I'm a political radical with Dr. Jensen, and a, you know, kind of a secular radical in that, in my ideal world, there would be no religion. I'm not going to personally persecute it, do anything bad to it, but, you know, I'd like to go all the way, honestly. I want to eradicate capitalism and Christianity and religion both. You know, while we're eliminating things, let's just, you know, just you know, finish the job. And of course, a lot of people say, first of all, you should play nicer than that, or sometimes religious people will say, well, you shouldn't criticize religion, that's like persecution. And of course, that's utterly false. Dr. Jensen and I know all too well that the job of academics and politicians and everybody else in a free society is to criticize, at least to, you know, point out the flaws. You have to be able to take that. If you can't take that, get the hell out of the public square, quite honestly, because that's what happens there. You know, if you want to come into the classroom, that's what we do in the classroom. I teach physical anthropology, and I'll talk about, you know, creationism or intelligent design if you want, and give it a really thorough analysis. That's not what they want. They want, you know, you to talk about it and present it as if it's another valid position, which it's not. So, you know, there's a lot of different issues about the radicalism. There are radicals in any movement whatsoever, and, you know, bless their hearts. Sometimes it's not real radicalism, it's, you know, kind of market radicalism. It's, you know, it's attention-grabbing radicalism. And it's a matter of who calls who a radical. Those of us who, you know, really see pretty little value in religion, that's a kind of a radical position. And I'm not bothered by that in particular. What was the second question?
Oh, discuss the likelihood of atheists eventually becoming a big enough group to take on the characteristics of the big religious groups.
Oh, I'm not sure it's a matter of size, quite honestly. I mean, some of the main characteristics of religious groups we've already taken on. For example, there's lots of schisms. already. There's several not very well cooperating groups already. A lot of personal kind of stuff. The Barkers and Gaylors split from Madeline Murray O'Hair and started their own group, and each of those things tends to be kind of a little personal fiefdom. There's a lot of competition, a lot of disagreement about kind of fundamental practices and principles and things like that. That's just, again, that's a human thing. That's neither a religious thing nor a non-religious thing. It's a human thing. And again, one of the damnable things is that whether you're religious or atheist, you're a human, with all the bad stuff that entails. One of the fears that I have actually expressed in writing myself is that non-Christians or any kind of other people would do what I mentioned before, kind of create their own stories and their own myths and their own poetry, their own symbols, and then begin to take them really seriously. Whenever those kind of things ossify into something real, something that if it's not our way, it's wrong, and we're going to have to stop you and shut you down, maybe even chase you away. I think that's always a human danger, and I'm a little afraid that those kind of atheist absolutists, because again, there's absolutists in religion, in atheism, and in baseball. People can be absolutists about anything at all. But those kind of people who take up an interpretation, a view, and turn it into the one, turn it into something that is concrete and eternal and unchanging, I think they're dangerous no matter what their particular persuasion is. And that's why I'm a huge Nietzschean in my philosophy, when he said once that all habits should be brief habits. Probably all beliefs should be brief beliefs. Don't take it too seriously yourself. He said you can't live without any beliefs or habits. That would be just as bad as having kind of permanent, ossified ones. But basically, kind of always, be ready there to pull the rug out from under yourself and question yourself and tear it down and start again. And I think as long as people of reason and temper can keep that attitude, it doesn't really matter specifically what they end up claiming or doing or how they organize. Just whenever anything gets taken too literally and too absolutely, it's a danger.
Okay, so do a couple. What's that?
Isn't Denmark a good example of an atheist society?
The question is about Denmark. Denmark and Sweden. Phil Zuckerman recently published a book called Society Without God or something like that. Based on his field work in Denmark, a society where people just don't talk about religion in particular. They're kind of even embarrassed about religion. But society functions. They still have groups. They still have families. In fact, they're one of the happier, more just kind of societies in the world. So absolutely, and they can do that without getting all radical about it. In fact, I think the goal of a kind of a non-religious movement would not be so much to oppose religion as to ultimately be without religion. And then there's nothing to be radical about anymore. It's like, once the world stops smoking, there are no anti-smoking radicals anymore. It's just not a problem anymore. There are no anti-religious radicals in Denmark. It's just not even on the radar, quite honestly. And just as, humans are born non-smokers, some go on to smoke and some regret it and some die from it. All humans are born non-religious, without any particular religion, and some acquire religion, and some go on to regret it and die from it. And you can, of course, kick the smoking habit, and my hope is, of course, that we will individually and collectively kick the religion habit too, eventually.
There's actually a lot more for Jensen and David. We'll try to even this out here. I've got a couple more for Bob. How can you be a kind of Christian atheist? Can you not lead a decent something life? I can't quite read that word. Moral, thank you, sorry. Can you not lead a decent moral life without being part of a congregation? How is Christianity in any way progressive? And the other one is, isn't technology antithetical to religion? And the sense that one's faith is challenged. In the sense that one's faith is challenged.
Okay, well, I think I already tried to make it clear that I don't think a religious tradition is the only path to a moral life. When I look at the world I live in and the people I associate with and the groups I'm part of, there are people from every imaginable sort of path. And we all come together around certain core values, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of tension among us because of that. So I'm making no claims to exclusivity, either for Christianity among faith traditions nor for faith traditions exclusive or dominant over secular traditions. As I said, a lot of my own beliefs come out of secular traditions like the left and feminism and such things. So no, I'm not claiming exclusiveness. I'm claiming that there's a value in it, just like there is a value in these other traditions. When people say, well, to go back to something earlier, the idea that all I'm doing is cherry picking. Well, guess what? Everybody cherry picks. You want to lift up the value of science. You're cherry picking because science has been at the core of some of the most intense destruction of the ecosystem, right? So everybody cherry picks from traditions. That's the nature of it, I think, because traditions are not monolithic. They're full of good, bad, and otherwise. And the whole goal is to extract from them and build on that which is positive, from my point of view. And everybody does that. The idea, I don't think anybody creates new stories at this point in human history. I think we're working off a stock set of narratives and we're constantly trying to work with them. In that sense, I think religion is kind of like folk music. My partner happens to be a folk musician. And one of the great things about folk music is it's constantly reinventing. It's borrowing old riffs. You take a traditional folk tune and you take one stanza and then you write your own and then it all morphs, and that's what culture does, and I think that's a good thing. Technology, I'm not sure I understood the question, but first of all, human beings have always used technology. There's nothing antithetical about technology and religion, because human beings have been using technology as long as we've been Homo sapiens. Different levels of technology. What I'm suggesting is that in the modern world, in the world that we've inhabited since we've exploited the energy of coal, oil, and natural gas, that technology has advanced to places where it literally threatens the health of the ecosystem that makes our lives possible, and that we need to rethink that. I don't think technology is at odds with religion, nor do I think one needs to be religious to recognize the very present dangers that this high energy, high technology world presents to us. So.
I'm going to say two quick things,
Yeah,
not so much in defense of, but kind of in alliance with Professor Jensen. Obviously, although personally to me the idea of Christianity and atheism is incoherent, clearly Christianity being so infinitely adaptable, it can in fact embrace that. In fact, one of my favorite examples is the 1960s or so movement known within Christianity, known as the death of God theology. Saying that Christianity, if you accept the idea that God is dead, kind of Nietzsche's idea and then kind of picked up and popularized later, can Christianity go on? And of course there were theologians who said, yeah, we can still be Christians without God, so clearly Christianity can do anything. In fact, it can also, secondarily, embrace technology, as all religions can. They're that, again, kind of adhesive. For example, I know I have this video of some Hindu factory workers who pray to their tools every morning before they start to work. And they pray to their machinery. Those are gods and spirits too. There's no reason why those kind of things can't be brought kind of under them, which again just shows how kind of fluffy and squishy religion is. It can really kind of do anything, honestly. But yeah, there's no reason why technology has to necessarily erode or oppose religion. People like Max Weber thought that would happen, but it really didn't. And in fact, you will notice that the fundamentalists in America are some of the most ardent users of technology. They got their satellites and their internet sites and all that kind of stuff. They're not, obviously eschewing, automobiles and, telecommunications. They're using it just fine. Those are just media to carry content. And the content is their content or any content. So religions can absolutely embrace what they want to embrace and reject what they want to reject.
So everyone hold on to the mic. I've got a couple more for you, David. Let's see. Communities. Oh, sorry. Are communities just imagined in that they are just another form of worldview narratives? Are communities just imagined? And then the other one is actually for me personally. I actually agree with what you're saying in terms of like religion. I think the world would be a better place without religion. on a personal level. But as an activist, I also see that the majority of people that are religious actually are decent people, and I share the same values as them. And so this change that happened in me, which is the people that the religious violence is the exception and not necessarily the rule. And so I'm curious about addressing this issue, which is how can you still argue a point of atheism, which I think that is important and valuable, while not alienating, you know, the majority of people who are religious, and getting them to, you know, my concern is they're going to dig in, and there's already, you know, their leaders are already saying, hey, they're coming to take your Bible, they're coming for you, you know, and I have, so a lot of this is strategic from my standpoint, of saying, look, I'll still argue the points about religion, but I think there's a healthier way to do it than the way that, you know, Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens. So I'd like you to maybe address that a little bit.
Let me, if I may, start with the second question, because I obviously totally agree with you. In fact, I find, as I've said several times, people like Hitchens and Harris a little offensive, partly because some of their claims and their politics are really not right, and partly because they sell more books than I do. It is a very bad tactic, as people like Harris and Hitchens and Dawkins in particular have done, to basically brand all religious people as, you know, crazy, as fools, as, you know, I think Dawkins or Hitchens went so far as to say they were all kind of morally backward, you know, to adopt, you know, such ideas and to actually practice such ideas. That's not true, and it's of course not helpful. Even if you thought somebody was an idiot, you shouldn't say that to them. That's not kind of tactical. So you're right. I think that probably, I think like any other movement, it needs to be a multi-pronged movement. I mean, there's going to be kind of the extreme side where ultimately it is to kind of get rid of all the Bibles, or not, more to the point, make people not want to read them anymore. You know, we're not going to take anything from anybody. You can read the Bible or the Communist Manifesto or whatever you want, but just to make it not something you particularly want to read. You know, most Americans don't read the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita. It's like not interesting to them. Probably, I mean, obviously any movement does need to be kind of a stage-wise thing. In fact, we probably really should think about it as something kind of like the anti-smoking movement. You know, you don't just go out and call all smokers idiots, and, you know, and smack the cigarettes out of their hands. First, you know, put warnings on the packages. Then you tax them. Then you kind of make it kind of unpopular to smoke, and they have to stand outside to do it. You kind of gradually kind of, you know, excrete that from the culture, if you will. Probably something kind of like that, too. On the other hand, will the religious, especially the more seriously, not even fundamentally, but seriously religious people ever kind of welcome that? Of course not. Absolutely not. In fact, I consider atheists, sometimes people have said that atheists are kind of like where maybe, you know, gays or blacks were some decades ago. And that's wrong in this important way. Being black does not somehow invalidate your whiteness. You know, being gay does not invalidate straightness. Atheism invalidates theism. And therefore, atheism will always be anathema to theism. It has to be. And there's honestly no way to probably comfortably accommodate the two. They will always be kind of at odds with each other. Less like black and white, gay and straight, more like smoker and non-smoker. With the non-smokers always kind of being, you know, literally irritated by, kind of, you know, hurt by that. While the smokers are saying, what's the big deal? Just don't breathe. So, well, you know, we share the world too, we have to breathe, quite honestly. So I think ultimately, yeah, it's impolitic to call all religious people indecent. Of course, there are many decent folks, and we should ally with them tactically when the time comes to oppose, like the real extremists and other specific kinds of things. But I think there's a fundamental division between atheism and theism and religion in general that really isn't seen in most other kinds of social movements, and it poses a special problem, tactical and strategic. Are all communities imagined? Yes. Are all communities just imagined? No. And of course, I assume that's picking up from Benedict Anderson's idea about imagined communities. I mean, all communities have some aspect of human imagining that we have something in common, even if it's like a blood relationship. So in that sense, yeah, it takes a certain amount of human, you know, kind of freedom from the absolute concrete and literal to imagine any kind of community. But once a community is imagined, it's real. You know, America is real now. You know, families are real. So it's not an opposed thing. The point, in fact, the term imaginary kind of as a noun is used a lot in social science. I'm sure Dr. Jensen's come across it too. You know, talking about, you know, the anthropological imaginary, or, you know, the artistic imaginary. Yeah, we humans can imagine things that aren't literally right in front of us. When I see my brother, I don't see the blood kinship. Obviously, it takes some kind of memory and understanding and even imagination, yeah, in a way, to accept that and to use that. But that doesn't make it any less real. What it does mean, of course, that we don't have to necessarily continue to imagine the communities that we've currently imagined. And while Professor Jensen is right that probably all the plots in the world have already been told, there are, of course, new stories we can tell if it's just somebody else doing that now. And just as, you know, there are plenty of groups have been imagined, we can unimagine them, we can unimagine whole institutions. Here's one that we did unimagine, happily, slavery. And because, you know, you can't look at somebody and say they're a slave, you can see that they're dirty and tired and different skin color, but you can't see slavery. That, of course, requires human imagination. We can de-imagine certain things and reimagine other things. And that, I think, is the great power and the great hope of humanity, that we do live in an imaginary world, and it's a good thing, it's a powerful thing, and it's a kind of a freeing thing, honestly.
So I'd actually like to have Robert address that as well, but I want to just clarify something. We have not unimagined slavery. There are currently over 27 million people living in slavery today. I work with an organization called Free the Slaves, and there's actually more slaves today than ever before in human history. They're just not legal slaves, but the practice of slavery is still very well known. I had to throw that out there. Robert, you want to address that as well?
Which one?
I'm curious to be addressing, you know, the idea of approach, the distinction between acknowledging this. I guess my concern about not alienating people, you know what I mean? Within the religious communities, in other words, I think that, like, my first concepts of human rights come from the words attributed to Jesus. And most Christians, if you talk to them, all the things that I disagree with in Christianity, a lot of them, they don't even know about, you know what I mean? And maybe some of the things that you've come across in your dealings with the church with that.
All right, well, let me just say a few things. I don't know if they're directly responsive to your question, but when I'm challenged by traditional Orthodox Christians who are rooted in supernatural claims, they often say to me, "Do you believe in God?" And rather than, you know, immediately go into a sort of argumentative pose, my response tends to be, "Tell me what you mean by that term." And that opens up then an interesting, often a very interesting discussion. It often leads to eventual, you know, recognition that the way I would use that term and the way they would use that term are quite different. And at that point, I often alienate people. You know, I think that when one takes up critical positions to the dominant power, you often alienate people, and that's not always a bad thing. So I don't go out looking to, you know, sort of humiliate people or try to demonstrate to people, as you said, why they're idiots, even if I think that. I think the question is, and this is one of the byproducts of this endeavor for me, is I think I've become more open to dialogue. I think for a long time for me, dialogue was something I pretended as I was trying to bludgeon someone into understanding I was right. I still think I'm right. I mean, I hold positions because I think they're correct. But I'm also more aware of the sort of ambiguity of life and the need to actually listen. And I've actually had a lot of really interesting and, I hope, mutually beneficial conversations with people in that arena. I wanted to go back and say one thing about community. I do think the word community is overused, and therefore, like any term overused, it essentially becomes meaningless. When you can talk about online communities of people who've never met and never will meet, I don't know what the word means anymore. For me, I think a meaningful conception of community is rooted in time and place. And I would also offer that one perhaps useful definition of community is a community as a group of people willing to take risks for each other. Now, that doesn't always, for me, have a positive outcome. As you pointed out, the Klan might members of the clan might take risks for each other. But at least, I think if we're going to talk about communities, we would acknowledge that is a real community. And I think in most of the social groupings we find ourselves today, in fact, we would not take risks and do not take risks for others. And part of my sort of dissatisfaction with some of the conventional ways of organizing politically was recognizing that many of the configurations I was in were in fact not communities in that sense. And the one that I think is most obvious is the sort of, especially the liberal wing of the anti-war community in the United States, which, especially during the Bush years, was happy to denounce war, come to rallies, but when push comes to shove, I think most of that anti-war movement was not and still is not willing to take risks. That is, to risk even anything as much as, you know, being looked at negatively by a neighbor. I mean, I've literally had people in the anti-war movement tell me they were afraid to put a lawn sign, an anti-war lawn sign in their yard because it might upset their neighbors. Well, then that's not a community, that's not a movement that could in any imaginable way be effective. So when I think about communities, I ask, what are those communities that bind people in a way that we will take risks for each other? And again, all of this is in the context, in my assessment, that in the coming decades we are going to face new political challenges that are going to overwhelm the existing structures we have on the left and in the liberal world more generally. And so I'm looking to explore those. And one place I found it is within a church.
So actually, I've got a couple more questions for you, Robert. So are you Christian agnostic or Christian atheist? And then another one is, why is righteousness at all necessary when reason can provide justice, equality just as well, if not better?
Okay, well, the second one, I think the application of first of all, I don't think reason and emotion are wholly separate. I think those are categories we've created. I think the human being is not quite so divisible. But to the degree the application of what we call reason, right, the rational faculty, it can produce an analysis that leads us to advocate for justice. But in my experience, it does not produce the commitment that leads people to take risks for justice. And so why do we need that sense of righteousness or that passion or that deeper sense? I don't know, because history demonstrates to me we need it. I've known lots of rational people who have no sense of the need to act. So I think whatever, to quote a friend of mine, and I have some copies of a pamphlet, I did an interview with him, Abe Osheroff. Nobody here has probably ever heard of Abe Osheroff. He was a radical activist his whole life. He died last year at the age of 92. And he used to say that the engine of history was passion. If you didn't feel it in your body, in your heart, in your gut, there wasn't much that could be accomplished. But he said, you know, if you think of that as the train that pushes history, you damn well better take your carry-on baggage, which is critical reasoning skills. So I'm not arguing that passion alone can be a reliable guide, but that without it, I don't think much really happens. Am I an atheist or an agnostic? When I wrote the first essay that got the traditionalists in my denomination so pissed off at me and led them to expel me, which actually technically is not true. They didn't vote to expel me. They voted to move me from the full adult membership role to what is called in the Presbyterian Church the baptized role. The baptized role is where you put children who've been baptized but not yet been confirmed. In other words, children who don't have the cognitive capacity to make their own choices. So, in a way, I thought I'd rather you could just kick me out and not put me in the category of a child. But the essay I wrote that pissed them off so much, I used the term Christian atheist, and it's about the only thing in that essay I kind of regret, not because I have adopted beliefs in supernatural beings, I still don't, but the term atheist doesn't describe how I feel. And even the term agnostic doesn't describe it. I'm a member of a Christian church. Am I an atheist? If you define atheist as a rejection of the supernatural, yes, then I'm an atheist. I'm not even agnostic, I'm an atheist. But to me, the term doesn't embrace the experience that I have as a member of that community. So I no longer refer to myself as an atheist, not on some, not on a reason I can even articulate fully. But that's part of what I'm trying to suggest. The experience for me is not always, reducible to words. A lot of it is about how I feel connected to other people, how I feel connected to myself in a different way, how my sense of connection to the non-human world is changing. All of that is part of why I belong to this church.
So I've got a couple more for David here. It says, reason is good and valuable, but if we are not totally rational, then is discreditism, is that right? Discreditism wise? Do we lose something we cannot afford to give up by discrediting the other? And then another one is, can reason program or teach emotions? Can reason be internalized as emotion?
I think one of the most dangerous things that people can do is assume other people's positions. And maybe it's because there is a tendency for people who are atheists or rationalists maybe to have certain other tendencies. Maybe that becomes kind of some kind of a rule that they always do. I value reason in the sense of looking at the facts and objectively analyzing them and coming to conclusions. But I don't think that reason is the only human capacity. I don't think it's always necessarily the best or final human capacity. I agree, of course, with Professor Jensen that we're emotional beings and, as anthropologists, cultural beings. Very much of what we do has nothing to do with reason whatsoever. Almost all of culture is pre-rational or non-rational, not irrational, not opposed to reason, although often it is. But it's got nothing to do with reason whatsoever. I mean, I wear pants, not because of reason, because of, American tradition. If I was in a tradition that didn't wear pants, I wouldn't wear them. And I don't wear makeup, not because of reason, but by reason I might look better with makeup on, quite honestly. But I don't because it's the tradition not to do that kind of thing. So I think that humans are multifaceted, multi-source kind of beings, and reason emotion is not even the end of the story. That's why I said reason, yes. Basic human nature evolved capacities, which are sometimes rational, sometimes not rational, sometimes anti-rational, quite honestly. And cultural and other things like that too. So discreditism, I don't know, is the person using my actual term? Is that?
Yes.
Okay. In the last chapter of my second book on atheism, called Atheism Advanced, I propose a more comprehensive term than atheism, because I agree with Professor Jensen and anyone who thinks about it very much, that that's really not a very, in the ultimate scheme of things, not a very useful term. Atheism does not mean opposition to or absence of all supernatural beliefs, because many supernatural beliefs aren't theisms at all. If you believe in, nature spirits, those aren't gods, and dead ancestors, those aren't gods. Supernatural forces like chi or mana, those aren't gods, but they're still religious concepts. So atheism only refers to the absence of the God concept. Many, many religions lack the God concept and have lots of other religious concepts. And there are, Americans perhaps who say, I don't believe in God, I believe in ascended masters or extraterrestrial whatever else. Those are not, the same thing. You can obviously do one or the other or both. I happen to reject God's and all other supernatural claims too. And that's why I say that atheism is true as far as it goes, but of course if you want to say, I also lack nature spirits and dead ancestors and such, you need a bigger term. And that's why I propose discreditism, which is the absence of belief in general, defining belief in a special way, of course, and I think the accurate way. If I didn't think it was accurate, I wouldn't do it. That is, beliefs are truth claims that are not supported by the evidence or actually contradicted by the evidence. Why would anybody have any of those? So I try to live my life without belief, and I try to not even use the word, quite honestly, if I can avoid it. There are other kinds of things that are often kind of also tossed into the belief hopper, which are not beliefs properly. In fact, belief refers to, in the kind of natural language use of the term in English, refers to three quite different things. Correct, claims, like, God exists or Jesus was the Son of God. That's either true or it's false. Propositions. Then there are confidences. You know, so if I say, you know, I believe that Professor Jensen is going to, you know, drive me to the airport tomorrow if I was going. I'm not making a truth claim. I'm saying I have confidence in him, and that's either justified confidence or unjustified confidence. It's got nothing to do with, you know, truth claims. And the third is commitments. That is, if you believe, well, I don't, but those who believe in markets, for example, so they're committed to markets. They want markets to exist and to work and things like that. So I have confidences, obviously, hopefully justified ones. I have commitments. I don't have any of those unsupported or blatantly contradicted correctness claims, and I think nobody else should either. So in that sense, that's kind of, you know, reason wiping the table of those kinds of things, not just God things, not just religious things, but all claims, whether it's about little green men or, you know, unproven medical technologies or whatever else. You know, you shouldn't believe things if there's no evidence for them. And in fact, if the evidence is, you know, blatantly opposed to them, which is why, and can reason, what was the word I wrote down there? Can it program emotion? Yeah, it can. And emotion can program reason too. Moving on. The atheism agnosticism thing is an important question because most people use those terms again totally wrong. They think that atheism, of course, means the absence of all religion, and it doesn't. It means, of course, the absence of God talk, God beliefs. You could have all kinds of other religions, and there are many, many, many atheistic religions. Not a contradiction. Atheistic Christianity is kind of a contradiction, because Christianity is atheism. It's a monotheism. Agnosticism is not a middle position between theism and atheism. There is no middle position. In yes and no, there really is no alternative. Maybe would be something like, you know, I haven't thought about it very much, or for some reason I haven't, you know, been able to come to a conclusion about the evidence. Agnosticism is not about beliefs at all. Agnosticism, from the very word and from the definition of it by Thomas Huxley, who first coined it, is the absence of knowledge, agnosis. He said, agnosticism means not claiming that you know something if you don't have the basis for claiming that you know it. In that sense, all people are agnostics about religion, because nobody has any religious knowledge of any kind. There is no knowledge, nobody knows, and largely they can't know, just like there is no knowledge of unicorns, because they don't exist. There is no knowledge of leprechauns, because they don't exist. And therefore, if gods are in the same category, theology is the same thing as unicornology. It's a science of something non-existent. And we can describe unicorns. They're white, you know, and they're horses, and they have, you know, horns on their head. You can describe leprechauns. You know, there are little guys with green suits and red beards and pipes and gold. You can describe gods. Doesn't mean that they exist. You describe all kinds of non-existent things. But agnosticism is, again, a process, a method of assessing your knowledge. If you determine that you do not have knowledge about something like gods, then the correct position is to reject that claim. To at least, there's no basis for it today. If there is tomorrow, hey, if somebody proves God tomorrow, I'll be the first one in line. But I mentioned they won't after all this time. But if agnosticism is a road, a process, a method, then atheism is the conclusion of that method or process on one particular question. Do gods exist? On other questions, you got to go down the same road and then determine whether the answer is yes or no. But agnosticism is not a middle position between atheism and theism. It's not a position at all. It's a process or a method. And if you apply that method continuously and soundly, the conclusion that you reach on the God question is no.
Okay, so in light of time here, I'm just going to read all the rest of the questions, which are for either or both of you, and then give each of you an opportunity to address the question as well as any other thoughts or comments that you have about this. So the first one is, Ben Franklin was not a very religious person, but the country loved him. Is there a parallel for our modern era on how to connect, or how to conduct ourselves? Another one is, does reason guide behavior, or, like religion, justify it? Another one is, please define justice and explain why we feel a need for it or are obligated to pursue it. Another one is, could you speak to the idea that religions weren't founded as systems to promote justice, but rather to explain things beyond our ancient capacities, to explain certain phenomenon, given that understanding wouldn't a lack of religion simply displace groupthink motivations into our groups? Very extreme environmentalism shows similar tendencies among other examples. And then lastly, do you really consider yourself a Christian? I guess this one's for Robert. Do you really consider yourself? What's going on here? Do you really consider yourself a Christian when you don't share the same beliefs, even the language or concepts? So we'll start with Robert, and then Dave, and then we'll end with David.
Okay. Yeah, I consider myself a Christian because there is no definitive Christianity. I share the same orientation with a lot of Christians. I don't share the same beliefs or orientations with other people who identify as Christian. As I said, the answer to the question is, who is a real Christian, is that there is no answer, so I don't fuss much about it. The question of justice, why should we care? How do we define it? Justice is the simple plea for decent lives. Why do we care about it? Well, why does some version of what's often called the ethic of reciprocity, what in the Christian tradition is called the golden rule, do unto others? Every tradition, it's the sort of roots of collective life. Why does that exist? I think that's not so much a choice as it's the way we have evolved. There is no way, if human beings are social animals, there's no way to live socially without it. And much of modern ideology drives that knowledge out of us, I think, and especially in capitalism. Let me just, in the interest of time, say a couple of things. One is, I think, even though there are those of us who reject not only the notion of the supernatural today, but the fact that there have been Christian traditions from the beginning that rejected it, I think no matter how much we say that, there is a way in which the discussion of religion always morphs back into the assumption that religion equals supernatural beliefs. And if that's the case, if you define that religion that way, then I'm not a religious person. If you look at David Dennett and people like that, that's how they define religion. And I think to do that is to narrow the definition and to impoverish the discussion. So I would caution against the tendency to always move toward that assumption. Let me end with I'm going to say two things, Dan. One is to quote one of my favorite philosophers, who's actually a plant geneticist who works in sustainable agriculture research. His name is Wes Jackson, and he co-founded something called the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, where they do very important work on how to move out of a high-energy industrial agriculture into a low-energy sustainable agriculture. And Wes advocates what he calls an ignorance-based worldview, which is to recognize that a whole lot of the trouble we're in as a species and as the planet is in is because, again, as I said, this assumption that human knowledge is adequate to run the world. And he said we'd be much better off if we recognized we are fundamentally more ignorant than we are knowledgeable. Human beings are clever. We make big buildings and little computers, and we tend to believe that that cleverness gives us the capacity to run the world, and I think that that's a dangerous assumption. It's an assumption that's taken us into two places that scare the shit out of me. One is the cell, and the other is the atom. The human intervention into the cell and into the atom may end up being the most destructive decisions ever made in human history. And they're made out of an arrogance, out of a belief that we have the ability to control the consequences of that intervention. That's a belief. It's not based on a rational assessment of evidence. In fact, a rational assessment of evidence, I think, would lead you to the opposite conclusion. So I think we always have to sort of put a brake on human arrogance, and that's why that humility that I think is at the core of the traditions is so important. The other thing I want to go back to is that for me, there is a part of this is, it's intellectual, it's political, it's thinking about organizing, but there's a part of this experience for me that is also emotional, that it is sort of beyond words. And to finish, I want to just quote from a translation of the Apostles' Creed that the minister at my church, Jim Rigby, did. Jim is an unusual minister in that he reads Greek and Hebrew, he goes back and he looks at original texts, and he tries to understand them through the lens of his experience. And he retranslated the Apostles' Creed, which of course has a traditional translation from about the 2nd century. I think the Apostles' Creed kind of came together in the Christian tradition. And I won't read the whole thing in the interest of time, but it's the last 2 sentences that I want to read. He ends his translation in a very different way than traditional translations with these 2 sentences. I trust in the spirit of life, the universality of faith, the essential unity of all who are of good will. I believe that no mistake is final, that love does not die with the body, and that life itself is eternal. And I've read that creed, his translation of that creed, as a member of the congregation when we've read it aloud. I've read it in situations like this, and I've read it to myself. And there's something about that invokes something beyond words for me. I almost never can read that without sort of not necessarily tearing up, but feeling something in my body. And I think that's part of the experience as well. And that's part of why I came back to a church. It's part of why I stay in a church. And it is, I think, an experience that we all should seek to have, whether we have it through traditional churches or through secular experiences, through art that can also invoke this in us. Wherever we find it, I think we should hold on to it, because it is part of what does, in fact, I think, make us human.
Indisputably. Obviously, atheists have experiences too. Sometimes have emotions and tastes, and sometimes we even love and things like that. I think the point that I want to make, that I do make, especially in the second part of my first book, is that all of those things are human and natural. In fact, they're all secular, in that they're all here and now. We don't have to go to some other dimension or some other time for those. We of course have our ties to our past, to our stories, to our myths, but we're here and now. We're in the physical world. We're at this moment in the present, and to give those things over to something else, as I say in my, in fact I was going to read a passage from my book, but it would take too long, is I think the ultimate betrayal of our humanity. It's to say that's not really us. That's coming from somewhere outside of us, bigger than us. And it is us. We are capable of all those wonderful things, and to get back to the theme of today, all those horrible things, because we're human. And we love and we hate, and we help and we hurt. If there's one sensible passage in the entire Judeo-Christian scriptures, it's of course Ecclesiastes, who at least realizes sometimes you hate, sometimes you love. It's the way it goes. Franklin was an impious person, but still a popular figure. And of course there are lots of those today. Brad Pitt is, in fact, a fairly outspoken atheist and a popular guy. And there are lots of other popular atheists, some you know, some you don't. Because we atheists can pass. Unless we mention it, nobody can tell us by looking at us. Some of us are popular. Imagine, many of my students, of course, have no idea. I don't talk about it in class. Some of them who are here tonight might be mildly surprised, quite honestly. We're just like everybody else and act just like everybody else. And so there's many, many popular ones, but the ones who are really in your face, like Dawkins, have their fans, they have their detractors. On the other hand, once again, he sold, hundreds of thousands of books, and many, many books have been written in response to him, all with the word delusion in the title somewhere, like Dawkins' delusion or such things as that. Does reason guide behavior? Yes. Does only reason guide behavior? No. Once again, behavior comes from a lot of different places: biography, emotion, culture, biology, all kinds of things. And in fact, as I think even Professor Jensen has said, or kind of implied, people can't reason to a particular moral code or sense of justice. People reason from their moral code or sense of justice. But those are not rational things, those are pre-rational things. Those are, again, kind of first principles, or not principles at all. They're evolutionary products. We're the kind of beings, as Professor Jensen said, who have evolved an interest in each other's behavior. of appraising each other's behavior relative to the standards of the group. And therefore, the question of justice, which I knew and hoped would come up, and it would have been, of course, probably, ideal if we defined justice at the start, but of course we didn't and we couldn't, and I consider it an impossible task. It's like defining morality. Justice is not a single, simple thing. Not all religions are about justice at all. Not all religions have that concept even. Religions are more about duty, if anything, about just kind of what you have to do as a human, than about justice. And in fact, they have entirely different concepts of justice. For medieval Christians, it was absolutely just to persecute heretics. In fact, if you read Aquinas or Augustine, they talk about just persecutions and unjust persecutions. Unjust persecutions are when bad people persecute Christians. Just persecutions are when Christians persecute bad people. That's okay. So justice is one of those relative terms which can't be defined and ought not to be defined honestly. But we ought to struggle, I guess, for, in general, as little suffering as possible or something. But, Plato struggled with that question. He couldn't solve it. And if he couldn't, we're not going to today. Was religion founded not for justice, but for explanation? Yes and no. Religion fundamentally has nothing to do with justice whatsoever. Religion has to do with your human obligations to the pre-human world. Does religion exist for explanation? Religions explain some things. No religion explains everything. And religions, as the anthropologist Sherry Ortner said, and I love to quote this, religions answer the questions that religions ask in the first place. That is, Christianity does not answer the question, how do you get a better rebirth? It doesn't even ask that question to begin with. I did my fieldwork in Australia with an Aboriginal tribe called the Walbri. The Walbri do not answer the question, how do you get to heaven? Because the Walbri have no such concept as heaven. They don't ask that question. So religions explain some things they don't explain, they don't even ask about, and other things they say there is an explanation, but your little brain is too small to understand it, or shut up. Just don't even ask. This is none of your business. If you were a god, if you made Leviathan, it'd be your business, but it's really not. Religions exist to explain some kinds of things. Religions more practically exist to give humans some control in the world. Control over the natural world to make it rain and such. Control over their own bodies to heal themselves. Control over society to create rules and enforce them. Control over supernatural beings to make them happy and give us things and such. One reason for sacrifice. And religion exists, as I said in my opening remarks, to legitimize the social arrangements that already exist. That is, religion did not invent marriage, but Judeo-Christian beliefs legitimize a certain kind of marriage, basically monogamous heterosexual marriage. Other kinds of religions legitimize other institutions. In fact, most of the world's societies are polygynous. A man has multiple wives, and their religions justify that. Religions can justify the wars that you're in, the nations that you believe in. Religions can justify anything whatsoever, and that's really their main function. In fact, one of the cool things anthropologists have noticed is that religions, of course, are constantly changing to keep up with changing circumstances. So that, for example, in some African societies, we've seen that they would have myths that explain the origins of, say, the clans in the tribe. When the clans change, say a clan dies out, or two clans merge, or a clan splits, the mythology changes to justify that new clan arrangement. Religions are constantly, again, morphing to respond to the real material and social conditions in which they live. And if they can keep up and justify or legitimize any additional justice and peace in the world, I'm all for it. Unfortunately, they can also do exactly the opposite, and as I said in conclusion of my opening remarks, other things in religion can also provide those legitimations, and I think less divisively, less argumentatively, and on less speculative grounds.
Thank you, David Eller and Robert Jensen. I really appreciate this.
In the media about how there are certain parts of the world that are tribal, like the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, that a lot of tribal people there, and we wonder how they operate, and we are often very perplexed by them. But while that's true, there's a social organization that is tribal there. think it's important to recognize that we are all tribal. I mean, our evolutionary history is in that level of organization, and we carry that in us. That is, we are always rooted in the local. Our sense of the world is often very, very local like that. At the same time, the reality of the modern world is that we live on one planet. We understand ourselves as one human family, and especially for those of us who live in the imperial societies, there's an importance to always recognizing that, because the wealth of imperial societies, of course, were to a large degree extracted from other parts of the world. So our moral obligation to that world is crucial. We are fundamentally tribal, local animals who understand ourselves in a very specific way, in a very specific place, yet we have obligations to and understandings of ourselves on this global level as well. So this tension between the tribal and the universal, I think, is very hard to navigate sometimes. And I think that's one thing religion can help do, is understand how we live very much in communities as part of a universal human family. The other tension I see is the tension between what I'm going to call humility and righteousness. That is, as I suggested in the discussion of technological fundamentalism, one of the great problems in the animals we are is our tendency to arrogance. And I don't just mean individually. We all probably struggle with our egos and our capacity for arrogance. But I'm talking sort of at a more species level, that if you look at some of the fundamental problems we face in this question of ecological sustainability, a lot of them come from our lack of humility, our belief that human intelligence is adequate to run the world. And what we're discovering, of course, is that human intelligence is not. And I think we need to recover that sense of humility. And I think, again, there are aspects of faith traditions that are very helpful in that. In fact, I would argue that the appropriate way to read the story of Adam and Eve in the garden is a story, a cautionary tale about humility and what happens when human beings believe that they are godlike in that sense. But humility is all well and good, but if we face the kind of injustice we do in this world because of these illegitimate systems of power, then we need to combat them. And to combat them takes a sense of righteousness. You have to have a deep sense, a deep passion for justice, and a faith in your own ability to make the world a more just place if you're going to contribute to that. And so how do we balance this profound need for humility and this profound need for a sense of righteousness, not self-righteousness obviously, but a collective commitment? And one of the things, and this is where I'll end, that I find helpful is the conception in religious traditions of the prophetic. In both the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, the Muslim tradition, this notion of the prophet. And by this I don't mean that I believe there are specific people who have special status, who are prophets. You know, certainly in the tradition,
Okay, so we're going to start. Thanks everyone for coming out. My name is Jason Bosch, and I run Argus Fest, which is a local organization that works to raise awareness of human rights, social justice, media, and environmental issues. For the past 8 years, we've been showing documentaries, bringing in guest speakers. We brought in art exhibits and done music concerts as well. So every Thursday, we show documentaries at the Mercury Cafe, 22nd in California at 7 p.m. And then on Mondays, we're at a little coffee shop on East Colfax called Hook on Colfax. It's right by the Bluebird Theater. This Monday, we're showing a movie called Yes Men Fix the World. If you're not familiar with the Yes Men, they're some merry pranksters, political pranksters, that have come up with some pretty clever ways to draw attention to various issues. So it's a really great film that just came out. So tonight's event is something that's kind of a personal thing for me. In my life, I've always questioned religion, even as a very small kid. And by the time I was 12, I was pretty much done with religion. I thought, you know, I don't understand why people still believe this. That was just my worldview. And so I started to read a lot of Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins. And I agreed with them intellectually, but there was something that didn't quite set with me. Well, mostly, not entirely. But there's something that didn't quite set well with me because I also study human rights. And so particularly like I read Sam Harris's book, And it seemed like he was looking at the entire world extremely, just only through a religious lens. In other words, studying like, say, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, he didn't seem to have an understanding of a lot of the other things that are going on besides just the religion. And so I started to kind of question the atheists movement, although I still have sympathies with it. And then I read a book by Chris Hedges called I Don't Believe in Atheists, which is a really great book, in my view. David, you might disagree with me. So anyways, I wanted to have an event. My friend Robert Jensen, I've done several events with him over the years, and he was coming to town, and his new book is called All My Bones Shake. And so I wanted to kind of have an event to kind of flesh out some of these ideas. So I also invited David Eller, who's a local academic. He teaches at CCD. He's written Natural Atheism, and he's written also a book about violence. And so I thought this would be a really good opportunity to kind of flesh out some of these ideas. They're each going to say about 15-minute introduction from where they're coming from, and then we'll open it up to questions. So, and also, there's a donation bucket. If you'd like to donate, we ask for a suggested $5 to Argus Fest to help keep these types of events going. And there's there's free DVDs, so there's a bunch of documentaries over here on all sorts of various human rights subjects that you're welcome to take home with you, and a mailing list for Argus Fest. So check that out. And with that said, Robert Jensen, you want to start?
Thank you, Jason. I think Jason might qualify for the hardest working, unpaid progressive activist I know in Denver and possibly in the country. So thank you, Jason. I'm always amazed at how much Jason gets done. The first time I came here, I thought Argus Fest was some major sort of organization with dozens of staff people, and then I found out it was Jason. So he's really put a lot of his heart and soul into this work over the years. So thanks, Jason. This is a bit strange for me because the combination of the distance, the darkness, and the fact that I had eye surgery this year and still have not fully recovered means I don't have a clue how you people are going to react to this. Usually you try and read the group. I can't see any of you, so
You're naked.
well, thank God I can't see. I mean, now I'm grateful for that.
Burn.
So if I'm getting off track with you, I'm not going to be able to notice. To try and keep to 15 minutes, I'm not going to narrate the story that brings me to this particular book and this place. If I were to do it in 2 or 3 sentences, my story is much like Jason's in the sense that I think by the time I was about 8 or 9, I couldn't figure out why people went to church. It all seemed pretty strange to me growing up in a middle-of-the-road Presbyterian church in Fargo, North Dakota. The joke I always tell is, for me, my early experiences with religion were life-threatening because I was almost bored to death by the whole enterprise. So the minute my parents stopped making me go to church, I fled from the whole enterprise and was a self-identified atheist, secular person my adult life. Also got involved in left feminist politics, and my whole life was framed by the analyses of the illegitimate structures of power that dominate this country and this world within feminist politics, anti-racist politics, anti-capitalist politics, anti-empire politics. And as I was working through all of those things, I found all of those frameworks very helpful in understanding how the world that we live in works. And as I was doing more and more writing and public speaking, I adopted what I thought was a pretty pithy little line. For instance, when talking about gender and masculinity and the very toxic construction of masculinity in societies that are patriarchal, which is almost all societies, I would say you can be a man and all that implies in patriarchy, or you can be a human being, but you can't be both. And that line seemed to work, so I would repeat it in other arenas, and I would make the claim that you could be white in a white supremacist society like the United States, or you could be a human being, but you can't be both. I would argue that you can be an American and embrace all that means in ideological terms, or you can be a human being. So you get the point. I was suggesting that the systems within which we live erode and corrode our own humanity. And as I was working through all of that, I started to think, well, there's kind of an unasked and unanswered question in all of that, which is, what does it mean to be a human being? Especially, what does it mean to be a human being in this moment in time, which I think is a very important moment in time. Perhaps people always think they live at the most crucial time in history. That might be a conceit of people in general. But I do think there are a lot of issues we face, cascading crises, you might call them, that do make this a very important time. So as I was working through the traditional left critical feminist political analyses, I started also to think more deeply about how to answer that question. And about that same time, pretty much by accident, I bumped into coincidentally a Presbyterian minister in Austin, Texas named Jim Rigby, who I had heard of and knew as a political activist as well as a minister. He had a small church in suburban Austin, and as I got to know him, I realized that in addition to pursuing the same political agenda that basically I had, he was part of a progressive Christianity, it's often called, although I think that term really doesn't apply to him and his church, because I think it's far more radical than the term progressive might apply or might connote. And what I realized is that there were Christians, not only in the contemporary period, but as I started to learn historically, who did not conceive of Christianity as a set of supernatural beliefs or creeds. That, in fact, there was another approach to the concept of Christianity. And so I realized there were people who, like me, did not believe in God, if by God we mean a force, an entity, or a being somewhere up in the sky that is directing the universe. Like Jason, I mean, I gave up that belief when I was fairly young and still hold to that rejection of that. And I also learned there were Christians who did not take the resurrection of Christ as a literal historical fact. As I like to say, as far as I can tell, Jesus died and he stayed dead. And that all of this could be understood in poetic, metaphorical, symbolic terms, and that was not just a contemporary phenomenon, but in fact it had historical roots. And so I started hanging out at the church. I eventually joined that church. The more conservative elements within the denomination promptly tried to kick me out of the church when I wrote about Christianity without supernatural claims. And the more traditional conservative elements didn't much like that. But don't worry, I'm back as a member in good standing of the church. Some of you may have been worried there momentarily about the state of my soul, but rest assured, I'm on the path to righteousness again and a full member. You can always tell when you're a full member of a church because they accept your money and in fact solicit it, so that's a good mark of membership. And I've continued to sort of think through these questions, not only in a secular political context, although that still is a primary source of insight for me, but also through theology, through the stories, through the text and the tradition. In my case of Christianity, having been born in the United States, a country that is overwhelmingly Christian in character. If you look at public opinion polls, about 75% of the population of the United States identifies as Christian, whatever that might mean when they answer that question. About the same time, I also was working with a number of Muslims in political endeavors and realized there was a progressive Islam that was being crafted as well. And I got much more interested in these things. And it seemed to me that when we are facing the crises that we are, I'm willing to draw on the wisdom and the organizing potential of any tradition that it seems to me is aimed at the fundamental values that I hold, which are values around justice and sustainability, and a way of organizing our concerns about the world, recognizing the profound injustice that shapes human systems and the fundamentally unsustainable nature of contemporary culture. And in doing that, I started to think through ways to articulate that in this culture. And I started talking about what in the book I write about as the four fundamentalisms. The first fundamentalism we're most familiar with, which is religious fundamentalism, and the dangers of religious fundamentalism are well known. I won't rehearse them here. I also started to think about fundamentalism in the context of our conception of the nation. There's a national fundamentalism in the United States that, much like religious fundamentalism, that takes or claims a certainty in understanding the way the world works and the way the world should operate. Just like there is a religious fundamentalism, there's a national fundamentalism, a kind of hyper-patriotism that shapes this culture and is also extremely dangerous. We also live in a culture with a kind of market fundamentalism, especially since the fall of the Berlin Wall, a historical event I was very grateful to see, but it did eliminate from the world stage the presence of the concept of socialism. Whether the Soviet Union and its satellites were ever socialist is a debate we could have, but it certainly sort of freed up capitalists to make the claim that their economic system was now not only the best of competing systems, but in a sense the state of nature. And there evolved a kind of market fundamentalism, and we've seen the consequences of that particularly recently. So in addition to those three fundamentalisms, which are, I think, easy to identify, I also started to think about, in some ways, what might be the most dangerous and in the end debilitating fundamentalism of them all, which is what some people have referred to as technological fundamentalism. That in addition to all of the injustice produced by human systems, there's this profound, or this fundamental unsustainability of a high-energy, high-technology culture. And the technological fundamentalism, I think, is seen when we face the problems created by this high-energy, high-technology culture. The answers that so many people want to offer, the solutions, so to speak, to those problems, are simply more high-energy, high-technology processes in gizmos to solve the problems created by high-energy, high-technology. And I think there's a kind of fundamentalism in that as well that I actually think may turn out.
Something you said?
No, nobody ever pays attention to what I say enough for things to act in reaction. Especially my son, I've learned, in terms of those who don't pay attention. So when I try to organize my thinking around the world we live in, the injustice, the unsustainability of that world, I think those are useful ways to think about it. Well, what does religion have to offer? Well, in the few minutes I have left, as I try to work through these things, I see several tensions that are very difficult to figure out how to resolve. And I think my own sort of investigations into theology, my own now membership in a community that's formed around that theology, have demonstrated to me that there are some positive aspects to that. The two tensions I want to talk about very briefly are the tension between the local and the global. What I mean by this is that if you think about the evolutionary history of the human being, you know, the vast majority of our evolutionary history was in relatively small band-level societies, what we tend to use the word tribal. You know, there's a lot of discussion in the United States, and especially